Elara Kale felt the desert wind slice through her, a stark contrast to the oppressive silence of the family villa. Some stories are hidden in plain sight. You walk by them, completely unaware of the poison they carry. This is one of those stories, a family's prestige, hard-won and centuries old in the sun-baked city of Casablanca, Morocco, completely devastated in a way no prophecy could have foreseen. It began with something so routine, a simple family request. Two adolescent young men were sent to spend a 4-week summer with their estranged grandmother while their parents were away on an urgent deployment to Rabat. It was meant to be a chance to bridge the distance, to share the old stories, to simply exist together. But within the villa's high, stone walls, something else was waiting, a quiet infection no one detected. Elara Kale had been a widow for years. Her husband, Khalil, was gone, her children, Amira and Tariq, had their own lives, and her magnificent home in the wealthy Anfa neighborhood was now quiet in a way that truly chilled her. But she never saw this coming. She never imagined that the reunion she'd waited for would lead to, well, something infinitely more destructive. The moment her grandsons, Zayn and Omar, stepped through the ornate, cedar door, everything fractured. At first, it was just a gentle shift, a faint, almost imperceptible discomfort. But as the long, scorching days bled into nights, the tension didn't just grow, it became a living thing. Simple things, the ritual of the evening iftar, the casual discussions over mint tea, transformed into something heavy, something that made Elara question everything she thought she knew about family, about her own strength. Zayn and Omar, the twin grandsons she hadn't seen since they were children, were no longer the boys of her memory. They had matured into powerful young men, possessing a bold confidence that made her deeply uneasy. Yet, she couldn't articulate why. Perhaps it was just their sheer presence, or perhaps it was a far older, deeper wound surfacing. 4 weeks. That's all the trip was supposed to last. 4 weeks together, and then life would settle back into its lonely rhythm. But sometimes, a single month can undo a lifetime. Sometimes, what appears innocent is the fuse on a catastrophic bomb. The matriarch, her grandsons, and a secret that split their bloodline. So, what happens when the moral lines we rely on are vaporized? When the ties of kin unravel in ways we never thought possible? This is the story of a Moroccan family and the forbidden secret that would consume them. A secret that should have been extinguished before it ever drew its first breath. Trust, love, blood. How far can they be stretched before the fiber breaks? And when they do, who is strong enough to gather the scattered pieces? Stay with us, because this is where the inevitable descent into madness truly begins. And before we go further, if you're finding this story as intense as I am, please do me a favor, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support lets us keep bringing you these dark, captivating narratives. Elara Kale. A name once synonymous with respect and virtue in Casablanca, a woman famed for her unshakable composure and resilience. Now, in her late 60s, Elara had lived a life marked by deep affection, unbearable loss, and most recently, a haunting stillness. It hadn't always been this way. There was a time when her villa pulsed with the sounds of animated conversation and children's footsteps, a time when she was surrounded by friends, her children, and the man who was her anchor, her husband Khalil. For over a decade, Elara had lived in the perpetual twilight of Khalil's absence. Khalil was her foundation, the one soul who kept everything centered, no matter how chaotic the outside world became. They had built an empire of life together. Memories, their 2 children, and eventually, their beautiful grandchildren. But when Khalil passed away, a fundamental part of Elara's world cracked. The sprawling home they had shared became silent, stiflingly so. Elara had been raised in a traditional conservative household in the old Medina, a place where duty, honor, and family integrity were the very air she breathed. Her parents had drilled into her the absolute necessity of putting family first, of honoring those sacred bonds, and living a life of uncompromising morality. She had carried those edicts through her marriage, through raising her children, and even now, as a solitary grandmother. But as the years of widowhood stretched on after Khalil's death, that once razor-sharp sense of right and wrong began to soften, to blur at the edges. Loneliness is a predatory beast. It creeps in as a low thrum at first, a whisper you can mostly ignore. But as the seasons change and years vanish, it becomes a roar. It consumes the space. Elara's once vibrant social world had faded to dust. She found herself spending her days completely alone in a villa that felt vast and empty. In that deep isolation, her yearning for connection became an overwhelming tide, and with it, her vulnerability intensified. Then came the scheduled visit, a brief, glorious reprieve from the grinding cycle of solitude. Her twin grandsons, Zayn and Omar, were coming to stay. She hadn't seen them since their boyhood. Now, at 18, they were statuesque young men, genetically identical, yet each with a distinct magnetic force. Zayn and Omar Kale, physically fit, instinctively mischievous, the sons of diplomats. They had been raised in a rarefied existence, moving from one capital to the next, with every advantage life could offer. However, with their parents, Elara and Tariq, constantly on official duty, the twins had become independent, pushing against limits and boundaries since childhood. When they arrived at their grandmother's home, they brought that same, unrestrained boldness with them. Elara and Tariq Kale had structured their lives around diplomacy, a life of continuous travel, state duty, and unexpected assignments. They were accustomed to being separated, with one managing the boys while the other was overseas. But this time, this situation was different. A critical, two-person summit had arisen in Rabat, requiring both of them to be absent from their sons for 4 weeks. It was far from ideal, but they had always had contingency plans, friends, trusted colleagues. This time, however, the only viable, trustworthy option was Amira's mother, Elara, the grandmother who hadn't hosted the boys in ages. On the surface, it was flawless, a chance for the twins to finally reconnect with the woman who had helped shape Amira's life, and a chance for Elara to escape the mental cage of her own isolation. But Elara was wrestling with a deep sense of unease. A profound hesitation gnawed at her. She trusted her mother implicitly, but something about leaving her adult sons with Elara for this extended period felt fundamentally wrong. Elara and Elara had always shared a fraught, complex relationship, the kind of mother-daughter bond that was both intensely close and painfully distant. They loved each other deeply, but years of unresolved tension and unspoken words lay buried beneath the polite, careful surface. Elara had been demanding, perhaps overly strict, during Amira's formative years, instilling the same severe moral code she had grown up with. Now, Elara sometimes wondered if that rigidity had left unseen scars. So, when the necessity of leaving the boys with her mother arose, Elara fought the urge to say no. She knew her mother adored the twins, but a small, urgent voice in the back of her mind screamed that this was a terrible mistake. It was the combination of the timing, the boys' age and physical maturity, and her mother's debilitating, multi-year loneliness. Ultimately, the choice was made. It was pitched as a good thing for everyone, a period for Elara to nurture the bond with her grandsons, and a time for Elara and Tariq to focus on their critical mission. Elara convinced herself it was the only rational decision. Elara and Tariq departed for Rabat. Their sons, Zayn and Omar, settled into their grandmother's venerable home. It was only 4 weeks. What could possibly go wrong? Elara had no idea that in those 4 weeks, her family would be permanently altered. Elara was ecstatic, more invigorated than she had been in years. The opportunity to see her grandsons again, to have life and movement filling the vast house, it felt like an undeserved blessing. She had missed them deeply, and the sheer thought of caring for them again filled her with a sense of purpose she'd forgotten. But when she saw them, truly saw them, something inside her shifted alarmingly. The boys were no longer the little children she remembered. They had exploded into young men, tall, physically imposing, and utterly comfortable in their own skin in a way that took Elara's breath away. It wasn't just their size. It was their demeanor, the easy masculine way they occupied space. They moved through the villa as if they were its owners, often lounging in clothing that seemed purposefully revealing, their bare chests or muscular legs casually on display. At first, Elara's mind raced for an appropriate reaction. She told herself it was just youth, just normal behavior for boys their age. But the discomfort was a tangible thing, picking at her composure. She politely asked them to cover up. She attempted to lay down firm ground rules. But the young men seemed indifferent. They shrugged, continuing to sprawl around the house in the same provocative manner. Elara repeated the mantra, "They're just being boys," but deep down, she knew this was insufficient. She felt something dark and primal stirring, something she was not prepared to face. It had been over a decade since her husband Khalil had passed. 10 long, empty years of sleeping alone in a bed that was designed for two. Elara had worked tirelessly to remain active, to keep herself mentally engaged, but loneliness is a parasite. It finds the empty, abandoned spaces in your soul and fills them until it is the only sensation you know. And now, with her grandsons inhabiting her home, a desire she had ruthlessly suppressed began to crawl to the surface. Initially, it was just an observation, a fleeting moment of acknowledging that her grandsons had grown into undeniably attractive young men. But as the days passed, that stray thought began to deepen, to fester. Elara felt herself losing control. She tried to crush the thoughts, but the more time she spent in close proximity to the twins, the harder it became to ignore the rising tide. There were micro-moments that sent a shockwave through her certainty. The way their eyes held hers for a fraction too long, the casual, confident smiles, the sheer grace of their physical movement. It was all so innocent, so familial, but to Elara, it felt charged, electrified. She could feel her own profound unease, her own unwanted physical draw, growing, and it terrified her. This is wrong. These are my blood grandsons. Yet the loneliness was a far stronger drug than she had ever understood. As the 4 weeks advanced, Elara found herself trapped in an excruciating internal war. Her conscious mind desperately wanted to be the stately, loving grandmother, the one who cared for her kin, who bonded with them through the natural, sacred connection of family. But the longer they stayed, the more crippling the internal conflict became. She didn't want to admit it, but she could feel the absolute line between morality and transgression beginning to melt away. And with every passing day, the weight of that moral compromise grew heavier, suffocating her. She had no idea how to stop it. She didn't know if she even possessed the will to try. And as she watched her grandsons move through her home, so assured, so heedless, she couldn't help but wonder, was it already too late? Had something irreversible already taken root between them? The answer was approaching, and it would undo everything. It was a still, humid evening, the kind that made the villa feel heavy and quiet. Elara sat stiffly in her ornate chair, attempting to read an old novel, but the Arabic script blurred into an incomprehensible haze as her mind raced. She could hear them clearly in the adjacent living room, the twins, Zayn and Omar. Their deep, easy laughter echoed through the large space as they wrestled playfully. It was a sound she should have cherished, the sound of youth and life reclaiming her home. But now, as she listened, it activated something else within her, something she could not name, something she deeply wished to extinguish. She glanced toward the arched entryway where they were grappling. Their muscular young bodies moved with a powerful, unthinking confidence that tightened her chest. They had changed so much since their boyhood. No longer boys, but young men, tall, powerful, and brimming with kinetic energy. Their exposed skin, glistening lightly from the Moroccan heat, drew her gaze like a magnet. She attempted to look away, tried to force her attention back to the book, but her eyes repeatedly drifted back. No matter how hard she fought the urge, she couldn't stop watching. Elara felt her heart pound with intense guilt. These are my grandsons. She had cherished them, loved them, and yet here she was, fundamentally incapable of shaking the illicit desire growing inside her. It was as if a sacred boundary had been violated, but not by them, by her. She was the one who had allowed her thoughts to stray into a landscape they had no right to traverse. She commanded herself to move, to stand up, to exit the room, but her limbs felt like marble, anchored to the floor. Her eyes remained locked on the scene. The boys, oblivious to the storm raging within their grandmother's mind, continued their vigorous, playful combat. But there was a quality to their movements, something almost deliberate. Their laughter was genuine, their bodies pressed intimately together as they strained against each other. Yet, beneath the surface, a new awareness simmered, a profound shift. And as the evening deepened, they began to sense it. They began to sense her watching. Elara felt the air in the room grow thick and volatile, but she was incapable of tearing herself away. She watched as Zayn, always the more assertive of the two, broke free from his brother's grip and stood upright. His chest heaved with heavy breaths. His eyes met hers, just a fleeting instant, and in that glance, Elara felt a tremor of pure, raw sensation she hadn't experienced in over a decade. She didn't understand it, she didn't want to, but it was there, and she knew, with absolute certainty, that he had seen it too. Omar, the quieter twin but no less bold, joined his brother, standing tall as they regained their breath. They both looked toward her, a playful residual smile still on their faces, but their eyes were windows to something much deeper. They understood. They could feel the electric change in the atmosphere, the thick, unspoken tension that had flooded the room. And in that terrifying moment, the long-established boundaries between kin began to dissolve. The remainder of the evening was cloaked in a heavy silence. But the significance of what had been initiated was inescapable. Elara felt it in every glance, in every shift of weight. Her pulse hammered, her thoughts spinning with a chaos she couldn't harness. She had lost her moral compass, and deep down, she knew it. Yet, she desperately clung to the fragile hope that it was all an illusion, that it could still be reversed. But the young men had seen too much. They were no longer boys, and they knew precisely the next move to make. That night, as the family sat down for their late dinner, the silence was almost a physical weight. The usual easy banter and laughter had been replaced by the quiet, careful clink of silverware on the fine porcelain. Elara could barely bring herself to look at them, the shame of her own desires pressing down on her. But as the meal progressed, she felt a sudden, seismic shift. Zayn, seated directly beside her, moved his chair infinitesimally closer. His knee brushed against hers beneath the heavy, polished table, and Elara felt her heart leap into her throat. She tried to dismiss it, a simple accident, but then he reached out his hand and touched her forearm. It was a light contact at first, but it lingered. Elara froze entirely. Her mind screamed for her to recoil, to put an immediate end to this before it spiraled further. But she didn't. She couldn't. Her arm remained still, his fingers resting with unnerving familiarity on her skin. In that terrible moment, everything she had tried to suppress rushed to the surface, overwhelming her control. Omar, watching the exchange from across the table, noticed the subtle change. He stood up, moving slowly and deliberately around the table until he was directly behind her. Elara felt his presence before she saw him, a sudden, hot pressure that stole her breath. And then, without uttering a single word, he wrapped his arms tightly around her shoulders. It was a gesture that, in any other context, would have been innocent, comforting. But this was not. His young, hard body pressed against hers in a way that was profoundly and disturbingly wrong. But she did not move. She did not push him away. She was utterly paralyzed. She had lost all control. Every rule she had ever lived by, about right and wrong, about the sanctity of family, had irrevocably slipped away. And as Omar's arms tightened around her, and Zayn's hand remained firmly on her arm, Elara Kale knew that the line was not just crossed, it had been shattered. This was no longer family. This was something darker, something forbidden. Elara, who had spent her entire existence upholding a bedrock of morality and integrity, had utterly collapsed. Her guilt, her profound loneliness, her desperate, aching need for human touch had pulled her down a path she could never have conceived. And as she sat there, encircled by her two grandsons, she knew there was no coming back. The illicit relationship had begun. The days that followed were an agonizing, confusing blur of secrecy and overwhelming desire. The twins, having witnessed their grandmother's profound vulnerability, did not relent. They pushed harder, testing the limits of what they could demand, of what she would surrender. And Elara, who had once been so formidable, so certain of her moral strength, had become utterly submerged in a maelstrom of emotions she could no longer steer. She had breached a boundary she swore she never would, and now, she was drowning in the depth of it. What began as a single catastrophic moment of weakness, a touch she hadn't pulled away from, quickly spiraled into something infinitely more perilous. A secret. A secret she couldn't escape, no matter how desperately she tried to convince herself that the end of the 4 weeks would bring salvation. But as the days stretched into weeks, it was sickeningly clear. The affair had taken a deep, toxic root, and there was no pathway to reverse it. Elara, who had dedicated her life to a strict moral code, now found herself consumed by a blinding, illicit attraction. The twins, Zayn and Omar, had identified her fatal weakness, and they exploited it with a calculating efficiency. What started as a single night of moral collapse morphed into a twisted relationship where her shame was willingly consumed by a darker, more pressing need. The boys, once her cherished grandchildren, were now something else entirely, and they knew they held the power. In those few, quiet moments after the twins had left her bedroom, or when she found herself briefly alone in the villa, the crushing guilt would return. Memories of Khalil, her deceased husband, would flood her mind. She would close her eyes and see him, the man she had adored, the man she had built her world with. The laughter they had shared, the security of his embrace, the sheer comfort of his presence. They had been genuinely happy once. But now, that happiness seemed like a long-forgotten mirage. And every time she opened her eyes, the brutal reality of her situation crashed back in. Khalil had been her everything, a man of unwavering principles, a man who consistently chose the path of honor. Elara remembered their long, companionable walks along the Corniche, their intimate conversations late into the Moroccan night, the way he would simply hold her hand and make her feel utterly safe. But that safety had been buried with him. In its place, only a consuming loneliness remained, a void that had metastasized over the years. And now, it had led her to this. She tried to tell herself that this nightmare was temporary, that the boys would leave and the villa would be cleansed. But the more time they spent together, the more she understood that they had seized control, not just of her body, but of her mind, her emotional state. They had mastered the art of manipulation, of keeping her bound to them. They would whisper exactly the right words, touch her in exactly the right ways, and each time, she would fall deeper into their carefully laid trap. The dynamic between them devolved into a sick, twisted game. The twins reveled in the control they wielded over their grandmother, pushing her limits further with each passing day. They would tell her things that made her feel desired, vibrant, important. But it was a sophisticated fabrication, a lie designed purely to keep her captive in their toxic grip. And the deeper Elara descended into the madness, the more she lost her true self. The woman she had been, the proud mother, the devoted wife, was gone, replaced by a desperate shell she no longer recognized. And yet, they were not as careful as they believed. The villa, once a sanctuary of peace, now felt like a high-security prison, with a secret lurking, vibrating in every corner. Neighbors would occasionally stop by, dropping in for a courtesy chat or to share fresh dates from their garden. And each time, the internal tension within Elara would skyrocket. Elara would stand at the door, forcing a smile, trying desperately to project calm, while the young men lingered just out of sight, listening. One misplaced word, one careless, unguarded gesture, and everything would be exposed. One sweltering afternoon, as Elara exchanged small talk with her neighbor, Aisha, at the entryway, she felt the sheer, suffocating pressure of the secret almost crush her. Aisha's friendly chatter seemed miles away, drowned out by the jackhammer rhythm of Elara's heart. The twins were upstairs, their presence a palpable, oppressive weight. She knew that if Aisha stepped inside, if she saw the sheer terror in Elara's eyes, the devastating truth would be laid bare. And yet, somehow, Elara managed to sustain the illusion. She smiled, she nodded, she sent the neighbor away without raising suspicion. But it wasn't just the neighbors. There were the periodic digital calls from Amira, her daughter, the boy's mother. The conversations were kept short, but each one felt like a nuclear clock ticking down. Elara would answer, her voice strained, her responses unnaturally measured. She could hear the boys in the background, their presence a constant, cruel reminder of the secret they all held. And every time Amira asked how the stay was progressing, Elara would lie. She would insist that everything was wonderful, that the boys were respectful, that they were enjoying their time. But the truth was always there, just beneath the thin ice, waiting to rupture. The twins were reckless, too bold for their own safety. They would walk through the house with a sense of utter invincibility, knowing they had their grandmother completely under their thumb. And yet, they came terrifyingly close to being discovered more than once. There were moments when Elara would call to check in, and the boys would laugh quietly from the other room. One of them would brazenly mouth the words to answer the call, daring Elara to let the secret slip. She never did. She couldn't. There were nights when Elara lay wide awake, staring at the ceiling, the sheer weight of the lie crushing her. She would think of Khalil, of his absolute disappointment if he could see her now. She would think of her daughter, of the family she had labored to build, and how it was all crumbling to dust around her. And yet, she was powerless to stop it. She couldn't escape the psychological hold the young men had over her. Their secret was a fragile, ticking mechanism, held together by sheer lies and manipulation. But it was mathematically impossible for it to last. The boys were too confident, too assured of their control. And Elara, once so strong, so sure of her world, had lost all understanding of who she was. With each passing day, the emotional pressure intensified, and with it, the paralyzing fear that the whole structure would collapse. As the weeks neared their end, the secret affair became a corrosive poison, eating away at every corner of their shared existence. And even though they had, miraculously, kept it hidden until now, Elara knew it was only a matter of time before the final, devastating truth emerged. And when it did, the consequences would be more shattering than any of them could possibly fathom. There are pivotal, irreversible moments in life that instantly vaporize everything we believe in. Moments that unfold without a whisper of warning, where everything we hold sacred dissolves in a horrifying instant. For Elara and Tariq Kale, that moment was now. They had been thousands of miles from home, completely trusting that their sons were safe and supervised under their mother's careful eye. But fate, an ancient Moroccan god of vengeance, had other plans. Their return, abrupt and unannounced, would reveal a truth they could have never conceived. Elara and Tariq arrived back at the Casablanca villa after an exhausting deployment to Rabat, a full week earlier than scheduled. They had decided against calling ahead, wanting to genuinely surprise the family, eager to embrace their sons after the long, stressful absence. As their black government sedan pulled into the private, cobbled driveway, they noticed something unnerving. The house was utterly silent. Too silent. There was no greeting, no spontaneous rush to the door, just an unsettling stillness. Tariq turned to Elara, a sharp look of concern etching his face. "Aina hum. Where are they?" he asked. Elara had no answer. She stepped out of the car, her heart rate accelerating. Something was deeply wrong. They called out for the boys, for Elara, as they hurried through the front door. But the only reply was the soft echo of their own voices. The villa felt vacant, almost abandoned. But then, it was there, faint, barely audible at first, laughter, followed by the unmistakable sound of running water. The sound was coming from upstairs. Amira's eyes narrowed, her pulse leaping. She exchanged a look with Tariq, and together they moved quickly to the stairs, their footsteps heavy on the polished tile. As they reached the upper landing, the laughter grew louder, mixing with the steady rush of a shower. It was emanating from the master bathroom, the heavy wooden door slightly ajar. Elara hesitated for a moment, deep confusion clouding her mind. Why would they be in the bathroom together? What is happening? Elara? Zayn? Omar? Amira's voice was louder now, infused with a rising note of insistence. Still, there was no response. She could hear them clearly, their voices mingled with the splashing water, but they had not heard her. The pit of dread in her stomach deepened into an agonizing knot. She reached for the door, pushing it open with a trembling hand. The scene that ambushed her on the other side of that door was one no mother or daughter could ever be prepared for. There, in the small, steamy bathroom, were her two sons and her mother. The three of them, together in the shower, in a way that defied any innocent explanation. The laughter stopped abruptly. Elara and the twins turned, their eyes wide, paralyzed by shock. But Elara stood frozen, unable to move, unable to draw a single breath. For what felt like an eternity, Elara could only stare, her mind utterly refusing to compute the reality of the sight before her. Her mother. Her sons. The magnitude of the betrayal was too vast, too overwhelming. And then, everything shattered. The air in the small room instantly became toxic as the truth hit Elara with the physical force of a hammer blow. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't something she could rationalize away. It was real. And it was happening. Baikal, Isra. What in God's name is going on? Amira's voice detonated in the room, cracking the fragile silence. Her shock transformed into a blinding, violent rage in an instant. She didn't pause for answers. She didn't wait for explanations. She stormed forward, grabbing Zayn's arm and yanking him savagely out of the shower stall. Out! Her voice was raw with pure fury, her hands shaking as she flung a nearby linen towel at him. Omar was next, dragged out just as forcefully. Both of you, out. The young men stumbled out, too stunned to offer a coherent response, their faces instantly pale, water dripping from their strong young bodies as they scrambled to cover themselves. Tariq remained frozen in the doorway, his mind struggling to catch up with the unimaginable horror playing out before him. Amira, however, was far from finished. She pivoted on Elara, her voice shaking with disbelief and agonizing betrayal. How could you? Elara tried desperately to speak, her lips trembling as she struggled for a single mitigating word. Amira, Waladi, it's not what you think. But Amira couldn't process it. She wouldn't hear it. Not what I think. Her voice was filled with venom, her fists clenched at her sides. You were in there with my sons. The betrayal was an unmistakable, seething force. The rage simmering beneath the surface threatened to become a physical eruption. Elara's explanation died in her throat. There was no argument, no possible defense for the act. Amira's fury was uncontainable. The pain of the betrayal was actively tearing her apart. I trusted you. I trusted you with them. Her voice broke as hot tears of rage welled in her eyes. The family she believed was whole, the foundation she had built, was now irrevocably broken. Tariq finally stepped forward, his voice a low, strained growl. Get dressed, he ordered the boys, his tone cold, completely devoid of emotion. He could not look at them, could not bear to see the monstrous shift in his family. The boys, still dazed, hurried out of the room, their heads bowed, shame and confusion etched into their pale faces. But Amira remained, her eyes locked on Elara. I'm sorry, Elara whispered, her voice barely audible. But the words were meaningless. Amira's heart was too flooded with a killing rage to register the apology. Sorry, she spat, her voice thick with contempt. You've destroyed everything. Her words hung in the steam-filled air, heavy, final. There was no possible redemption for this. The sacred bond between mother and daughter had been violently severed, the trust shattered beyond any hope of repair. Without another word, Amira turned sharply on her heel, her decision already made. We're leaving, she stated, her voice cold and distant. And we are never coming back. She stormed out of the bathroom, her sons silently following her. Elara was left standing in the stifling, steam-filled room, clad in nothing but crushing guilt and the deepest regret. Amira had said all that needed to be said. The betrayal had cut too deep, leaving no room for a possibility of forgiveness, no chance for reconciliation. She stormed out of the bathroom, the high walls of the villa closing in around her, her heart pounding with a murderous rage and sheer disbelief. Tariq followed her in stunned silence, and the boys, still reeling from the confrontation, trailed behind, their heads down, not daring to speak. But behind them, in that humid, violated room, stood Elara, her body trembling, her world in fragments. Elara knew, deep in her shattered soul, that she couldn't let them leave like this. She couldn't allow their last final memory of her to be this image of betrayal and disgusting shame. She had to make them understand. She had to make them find a sliver of forgiveness for her. Her mind was a whirlwind of panic, her thoughts completely chaotic as she snatched a towel, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she tried to cover her naked frame. Amira! Wait! Her voice was a desperate, dry gasp. But Amira did not stop. She did not turn around. Elara's heart hammered a frantic rhythm as she stumbled after them, her feet still wet from the shower, the thin towel clinging to her frail form. She was losing all grip on reality, her panic amplifying with every step they took away from her. "Please, Amira. You don't understand," she cried out, her voice strained, her breathing ragged. She hurried down the long hallway, her mind clouded by an overpowering cocktail of guilt and fear. She couldn't lose them like this. She couldn't allow this to be the end of their story. By the time Elara reached the top of the grand staircase, Amira and Tariq were already halfway down, their fury a palpable aura. "We're leaving. And we are never coming back," Amira spat out, her voice cold, utterly final. Elara's heart utterly broke at those words. She could feel her strength abandoning her, but she lunged forward, her bare feet moving too quickly, too recklessly. She had to stop them. She had to make them listen. "Please, don't leave like this," Elara pleaded, her voice rising to a frantic shriek. But the words were lost. Amira and Tariq didn't turn. They kept moving, their footsteps heavy with finality. Elara's vision blurred, her desperation consuming her. And as she took one final, desperate step forward, her foot slipped. The highly polished, wet surface of the top stair was a cruel, unforgiving trap. Her body lurched forward, her arms flailing wildly as she reached out for anything to anchor herself. But there was nothing. The fall happened in a sickening slow-motion reel. Elara's body tumbled forward, her frail frame twisting and contorting as she plummeted down the grand, echoing staircase. And then came the sound. A brutal, sickening crack. The sound of her skull impacting the hard edge of the lower step echoed through the silent villa, a noise that would stalk all of them for the rest of their lives. Time froze. Elara's body crumpled at the foot of the stairs, her fragile form collapsing into a heap. Blood instantly began to pool beneath her head, spreading a dark, horrific stain across the pristine tile floor. For a terrifying, endless moment, no one moved. Amira, Tariq, and the two young men stood utterly paralyzed, their minds struggling to process the sheer reality of the tragedy. The rage, the fury, all evaporated instantly, replaced by a horror so deep, so unimaginable, that it left them utterly inert. Elara lay at the bottom of the staircase, her body motionless, her face pale. The blood slowly, deliberately seeped into the grout of the floor. "Ummi. Mom." Amira's voice was barely a whisper, her mind still refusing to accept what her eyes were screaming at her. She rushed down the stairs, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she reached for her mother. The anger was gone, replaced by pure, visceral terror. "Ummi. No." The words came out as a broken sob as she collapsed beside Elara, her hands frantic as she tried to staunch the flow of blood, desperately trying to wake her. Tariq snapped out of his shock, moving quickly to his wife's side, his voice tight with urgent command. "Call an ambulance. Now." He barked at the boys, who stood frozen at the top, too stunned to obey. Zayn fumbled for his mobile phone, his hands trembling as he dialed, his mind a panicked void. Omar, still in a state of shock, couldn't tear his eyes away from the sight of their grandmother, lying still in the spreading pool of her own blood. By the time they reached the Royal Mansour Hospital in Marrakesh, it was tragically over. Elara Kale was gone. The woman who had raised Amira, the woman who had once been powerful, proud, and full of life, was now only a memory. Her body, frail and completely broken, lay still. The last of her strength had been spent on those final, desperate pleas for forgiveness. The family that had been ripped apart by betrayal and secrets was now eternally marked by tragedy. There was no rewind button, no way to undo the devastation. Elara's final, whispered apology echoed in Amira's mind, but it offered no comfort, only a deep, searing pain and the sickening realization that the mother she had loved, the woman who had raised her, was permanently gone. And the guilt, a heavy shroud, would remain with them all, forever. In the end, it wasn't the secret that destroyed them. It wasn't the betrayal or the lies. It was the fall, a single, desperate moment of panic that concluded with Elara's life slipping away, leaving behind only the shattered remains of a family that would never know peace again. Tragedy leaves behind a wake of psychological devastation, and for the Kale family, Elara's sudden fall was only the violent beginning. The moment her body struck the foot of those stairs, everything was transformed. The magnificent villa became a crime scene, the air thick with profound sorrow, crippling guilt, and 1,000 unspoken accusations. It was only a matter of minutes before the authorities were summoned. The blinding flash of the emergency lights flooded the quiet Enfant Street, casting long, grotesque shadows on the broken family trapped inside. The police arrived swiftly, their presence professional, completely detached as they clinically assessed the scene. The emergency call had been straightforward: an accidental fall, a fatal head injury. But the sheer weight of the emotional history that had unfolded made the scene feel infinitely more complex. As the detectives moved through the villa, gathering evidence, the family stood in a paralyzed silence. Amira, her face ashen with grief, watched as they asked their questions, as they meticulously examined the treacherous stairs, as they carefully avoided the growing stain of blood on the tile. The investigation was both swift and disturbingly thorough. The officers demanded details: precisely how the fall occurred, where every family member was standing, and what, exactly, had led to that final panicked chase. Amira answered the questions in a daze, her voice hollow, her mind relentlessly replaying the image of her mother falling. Tarek stood at her side, his fists clenched tight, struggling to maintain any semblance of control as he recounted his version of the events. The boys, too, were questioned, though their responses came out in fractured, incomplete sentences. Their minds were still grappling with the catastrophic events that had just annihilated their world. Hours passed as the investigation unfolded, but it quickly became apparent to the authorities that there was no criminal intent. The fall had been a sheer accident, triggered by a wave of panic, a desperate, final attempt to stop a family from completely dissolving. The blood, the motionless body, the shattered relationships, none of it pointed to anything more than a tragic, devastating misstep. The police concluded their inquiry, and the official ruling was made: accidental death. There would be no charges, no further investigation. Elara's death, as brutal and unexpected as it was simply that, an accident. But for the Kale family, the formal conclusion offered no solace. The official report may have closed the case file, but it could not begin to heal the monumental wounds that had been ripped open in that house. The family breakdown began almost immediately. The moment the police vehicles departed, the full weight of what had happened, and what had been disgustingly uncovered, began to sink into the survivors. The villa, once a refuge, now felt like a gilded tomb, every room echoing with the memory of betrayal, of sickening secrets, of profound, irreversible loss. Amira, once the stoic pillar of the family, felt herself spiraling. Her mind was a hellscape of blinding anger, overwhelming guilt, and paralyzing confusion. She had lost her mother twice. First, morally, and now, physically. And she was left to single-handedly manage the terrifying wreckage. Amira's relationship with her sons, Zayn and Omar, had always been a work in progress, but now it was irreparably broken. The twins were no longer the young men she had raised. They were now active participants in something dark, something that had annihilated the foundation of trust in their family. She could not bear to look at them, could not endure the shared weight of their guilt. The sight of them was a constant, vicious reminder of everything that had gone wrong. The mother she had trusted, and the sons who had betrayed her in a manner she couldn't even mentally process. Amira made a silent, final decision that day. She couldn't remain in that villa. She couldn't sustain the fiction that anything could ever return to normal. The bonds that had once held the family together had been violently severed, and there was absolutely no repair in sight. She packed her essential belongings, summoned the last of her emotional fortitude, and made the only choice she could. She severed all contact with her sons, refusing to allow the toxic secret that had destroyed their family to poison the rest of her life. But it wasn't just her sons Amira had to abandon. The sheer, overwhelming weight of what her mother had done hung over her like a suffocating shroud. How could the woman who had raised her, the woman who had instilled in her a granite-like sense of morality and honor, have committed such an unforgivable act? How could Elara, her own revered mother, have allowed herself to fall into such a deeply twisted relationship with her own grandsons? Amira couldn't reconcile the images. She couldn't understand how the woman she had looked up to her entire life could have betrayed her in such a colossal way. The betrayal left Elara grappling with a torrent of questions she couldn't answer. She felt agonizingly torn between the love she had once held for her mother and the all-consuming anger that now defined her. She desperately wanted to grieve, but she couldn't. Every time she thought of Elara, all she could see was the scene in that bathroom, the illicit look in her mother's eyes, the way the moral lines had been blurred beyond any chance of recognition. It was as if the woman she had known had never truly existed. Amira's heart was filled with torturous conflict. On one hand, she had lost her mother, and that pain was undeniable. But on the other, she had lost something far more precious: the fundamental image of the woman she had trusted, the moral compass that had once steered her own life. How could she possibly mourn someone who had betrayed her so deeply? How could she move forward when every single thing she believed in had been ripped apart? The rest of the family, her other siblings, those who had no direct part in the betrayal but who would now be dragged into the aftermath, would also feel the devastating weight of the truth. Amira's decision to confront them was inevitable. She couldn't carry the weight of the secret alone. She couldn't bear the full burden of what her mother had done. And so, one by one, she reached out to them, her voice shaking as she revealed the horrifying truth that had annihilated her immediate family. The conversations were agonizing, her siblings universally shocked and horrified by the revelation. They struggled to comprehend it. They had loved Elara, too. They had seen her as an unbreakable matriarch, a figure of strength and moral clarity. And now, that sacred image had been shattered for them as well. The Kale family, once unified by bonds of love and trust, was now fractured, each member struggling to understand how it had all gone so spectacularly wrong. And so, the Kale family was left in ruins. The official investigation may have concluded that Elara's death was a simple accident, but the emotional fallout was infinitely more complex. The relationships that had once held them together were broken beyond any hope of repair. The family that had once gathered around a shared dinner table, that had shared genuine laughter and deep love, was now irrevocably divided by guilt, betrayal, and a sorrow that would never end. Amira's heart would never fully heal. The oppressive weight of her mother's actions, of her son's wicked complicity, would remain with her for the rest of her life. She had lost more than just her mother that day. She had lost her sense of family, her capacity for trust, and the foundation that had once made her feel safe. And now, as she attempted to move forward, all she could do was try to rebuild a solitary life. But no matter how far she traveled, no matter how much time elapsed, the shadow of what had happened would always linger, a constant, black reminder of the family that was destroyed. In the end, it wasn't the police investigation that brought closure. It wasn't the ruling of accidental death that made the family feel whole again. It was the slow, excruciating process of acceptance. Acceptance that some things could never be reversed. Acceptance that some wounds would never close. And as the Kale family scattered across the globe, each member forging their own solitary path, one chilling truth remained: the secret that had destroyed them would never be forgotten. Some stories resist simple resolutions. The lines between right and wrong blur and distort until nothing is left in clear focus. In this tragic tale of betrayal, corrosive desire, and profound despair, the Kale family was left annihilated. But the real, haunting question remains: who, if anyone, is truly responsible for this catastrophe? Was Elara Kale a casualty of her own debilitating loneliness, driven to make choices she would have never considered had her life remained stable? Or did she willingly step into a profound moral darkness she knew was forbidden, but which she was simply too weak to resist? Loneliness is an omnipotent force. 4 years, Elara lived in isolation, the walls of her magnificent villa closing in on her, her heart aching for the companionship she had buried with her husband. She was a vulnerable target, her mind clouded by the deep sorrow of years spent utterly alone. But does that profound isolation justify her actions? Could her loneliness ever excuse the choices she made with her grandsons? Choices that violated every moral, sacred boundary? Or does it simply provide a stark explanation of how far a seemingly strong person can fall when they are left with nothing but their own spiraling despair? The twins, Zayn and Omar, were certainly not innocent victims. They were young men, yes, but they were not blind to the intense dynamic unfolding. They could see their grandmother's desperate vulnerability. They could feel the shift in the air, and they aggressively pushed the boundaries. What began as a playful, familial interaction quickly devolved into something darker, something profoundly manipulative. They were not children. They knew the fundamental nature of their actions. And yet, it's difficult to fully assign blame. Did they comprehend the sheer, devastating weight of their choices? Or were they caught up in a dangerous, intoxicating game that spiraled out of their control before they could ever apply the brakes? In this narrative, the boundaries of morality were stretched until they snapped, irrevocably twisted by the complex, warring emotions of each person involved. Elara, a woman who had always been a slave to the rules, found herself consumed by a desire she couldn't contain. The twins, once innocent in her eyes, became the fatal catalysts for her downfall. But who was the true manipulator? Who held the ultimate power in this twisted, tragic relationship? Was it the young men, deliberately exploiting their grandmother's desperate need for affection and connection? Or was Elara the one who meticulously set the stage, inviting a forbidden temptation she lacked the necessary strength to resist? The true tragedy of this story does not simply lie in the fall, in Elara's broken body at the bottom of the stairs. It lies in the permanent psychological scars left behind. Amira, the daughter who had once trusted her mother implicitly, must now grapple with the overwhelming enormity of the revelation. How can she ever reconcile the image of the woman who raised her with the one who betrayed her so profoundly? The anger she feels is a white-hot, overwhelming force, but beneath it lies a deep, cutting sorrow. She has lost far more than just a mother. She has lost the bedrock of trust upon which she built her entire adult life. Tariq also carries the immense weight of this tragedy. A father, a husband, a diplomat who thought he understood the family he was a part of. Now, he finds himself questioning everything. His sons, once the pride and joy of his life, are now tainted by the wicked choices they made. How does he move forward? How can he ever look at them, knowing what they've done, knowing how far they've fallen from the young men he once knew? And yet, they remain his sons. The bond of blood, the sanctity of family, complicates everything. Forgiveness may seem a cosmic impossibility, but the human heart possesses a strange resilience, clinging to a thread of hope even when all logic dictates that we must let go. And what of the twins, Zayn and Omar? They were once simply young men on the verge of their own lives. Now, they carry the crushing burden of their actions. Can they ever truly understand the catastrophic weight of their choices? Or are they forever marked by the actions they took in the terrible heat of the moment? The scars of this affair will follow them, an invisible, constant reminder of how easily innocence can be discarded, how quickly trust can be shattered. In the end, who is truly to blame? Is there a single, solitary person responsible for the utter unraveling of this family? Or is it the complex sum of all their choices? Do we have to look not only at Elara, but also at the twins, at the way loneliness and intense vulnerability intertwine to create something so tragically forbidden? And the biggest question of all lingers: is there any possible way forward? Can forgiveness ever be genuinely found in the wake of such a cataclysmic betrayal? Or has this family been torn apart forever? Perhaps there are no simple, easy answers. Perhaps, in the end, we are left only with the consequences of our choices, the crushing weight of our decisions. And for the Kale family, those consequences are more devastating than they could have ever imagined. In the deep shadows of every family, there are secrets waiting patiently to be uncovered. In the next episode, we'll delve into another dark tale of betrayal, forbidden passion, and tragic endings. Another family. Another explosive secret. And the question that perpetually haunts us all: how far can we fall before there's simply no path back? If you have been captivated by the sheer emotional intensity of this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel to stay updated on the next tragic tale. There are always more secrets waiting to be dramatically revealed, and more families standing on the terrifying brink of total destruction. Join us again, and become a part of unraveling the chilling mysteries that lie hidden in the darkest corners of life. Hit that subscribe button, activate your notifications, and be the first to uncover the next story of heartbreaking betrayal.